Hi, thank you. So, thanks for your interest, and thanks for hosting me, for putting me up for a couple of days here. I came in yesterday in order to avoid the presidential flights into the airport, and that worked out well. He went to New Jersey instead, so so I had an extra day with Kevin and Carol, so that was super. Suppose that you had a friend who was a couch potato his whole life, and he came up to you and said, "Hey, I've turned over a new leaf. I've joined a fitness club, I've hired a personal trainer, and scheduled some workouts, and every 2 weeks for 1 hour, I'm going to go and do some exercise." How's that going to work for him? Not very well, right? Well, suppose it's not even physical fitness. Suppose it was just something like, say, juggling. So it was more of a dexterity thing. Still not going to work. Suppose it's something like learning a language. It's just all mental. It's still not going to work, right? But if you're a backyard beekeeper with a couple of beehives, and they're over there in some opaque box in the corner of your yard, you go into them every couple of weeks. So how do you expect to learn enough to know how to take care of your bees when you don't spend enough time with them? And if you do spend enough time with them, they won't be productive because you'll be in there every day, and you'll probably roll the queen when you pull the frame out, and you'll be queenless and not even know it, right? So that's the problem that I'm coming here with a solution for, right? So this is I guess you could say I'm preaching here. This is a solution that I'm selling you, all right? And my solution is that you get an observation hive. You probably think of observation hives as in places like this, where there is one, or at a farmer's fair or something where they're selling food. But I'm suggesting that as a beekeeper, you set up a permanent observation hive in your house. And that way, you will learn a lot about bees, okay? This is mine, okay? This is in my dining room, okay? I've had it there since 2005. It's got, it's 2 deep frames. It's sitting on a scale. There's a feeder here. And then there's a tube going out the window. This is up in Washington, D.C., and that area. And that tube is open all year round. They can come and go whenever they want to. And I get to see those bees every single day, all day long. So I get to see what they're doing. And I really learn about bees that way.
How big is the tube?
It's 1 inch in diameter, 3/4 inside. Yeah.
Is that a 4 frame?
2 deep. That's all it is. 2. Okay, so I'll start with a little bit of background, and then I'll give you an example of a year in the life of this colony, right? Then I'll show you all of, and I'll go back through that and talk about all the dumb things I did, because the nice thing about an observation hive is it makes your mistakes very visible. When they're out there in the backyard somewhere, you don't even know you made those mistakes, but with an observation hive, you know you made them, okay? And then finally, I'll talk about the details of how some things you need to keep in mind when you set up your observation hive. And I have a few books here if you want to buy them from me, or you can get them from Man Lake or the Better Bee website. And a new edition of it is coming out from the Cornell University Press, but it won't be out till the fall, but you can get it from them if you want. And as Kevin said, I have a website where you can get this stuff anyway. You don't have to buy the book. So this is a quote from Michael Bush. I think he's been here. "Every beekeeper should have an observation hive, not only for what you learn about bees, but so you can see what's happening in your other hives." And I'm going to focus on the what you learn about bees part of it. Okay. The first thing that you get is you get the opportunity to observe your bees without disturbing them, okay? Because they're right there, okay? You see them all day, every day, from the time you wake up until the time you go to bed if you want to, and you get to see them in all the seasons. And so you get to see what's normal behavior for your bees at any point in time, okay? And you can see how they vary over time. And they vary, I'll tell you, they vary by the hour, they vary by the day, they vary by the season, and they vary from year to year. And you can really get attuned to those things and become well aware of what's normal as well as what's abnormal behavior. Okay? You can see the effect of your interventions or your lack of intervention. You know, you can see when they became queenless and you didn't do something about it, what happens to them until you take care of the problem. And the term observation hive implies that you're seeing something. And you can certainly see them. That's a fact. But you can also hear them when they're in your house. And the sound changes all the time. And because mine is right beside my desk, every time I hear a change in the sound, I look up to see what's going on. All right? You can also smell them. And they better smell good. If they don't, you certainly know something is wrong. And if you put your hand on the hive, you can feel the temperature differences, where there's brood, where there's no brood, where they're drawing comb, and you can feel the vibrations. So you can not only see them, but you can hear them and smell them and feel them and so on. So there's a huge amount of information you get from that colony. And finally, it's a nuke box. So it can serve as a backup hive to one of your other hives, and your other hives, you may need another hive to serve as a backup for this one too. But it's basically an extra colony for you. This is a page I pulled out of Mark Winston's book. This is the worker bee behaviors. So there's a whole list of behaviors here, and I'm not going to talk about any of them, but just to point out that there's a whole long list of them. So those are all the things you can see worker bees doing, as well as some of the ones that have beekeeping researchers have become aware of after this book was printed. And these are age-related behaviors, so you can see just from the chart how the age has changed. But this is just the worker bees. There's also, remember, drones and queens in there doing their thing as well. And you may also see mites, and you can see small hive beetles and wax moths and Indian meal moths and all kinds of neat critters in there. So you really get to see a lot of what's going on in the hive. Yogi Berra, you may know this guy. This is one of his lines. You can observe a lot just by watching, and that's the claim that I would make. Smart guy. So this is the weight. This is the year, the beekeeping year up where I live. And this is the calendar year going across the bottom of the chart. And hive weight is the vertical. So starting in January, you can see that actually if you start back in November, December, you can see the colony typically loses weight because there's nothing for bees to eat out there, and the number of bees is declining and they're consuming their stores over time. Then in April, we get our first nectar flow, March this year, but typically in April we get our first nectar flow. April, May, and June we get a nectar flow. The hive weight increases like crazy, and then the beekeeper harvests that weight, harvests the surplus. The colony will lose weight in the dry part, the hot, dry part of the summer, and then in the fall there may be a nectar flow, or we may have to feed the bees to get them ready for winter, because what we need there is a large number of young, healthy bees to get through the winter. All right, and that's an introduction, because what I'm going to show you now is one picture of my hive taken every month. Okay. I take a picture of both sides of the hive every week. And what that looks like is, if this is my observation hive, then I take a picture on this side and a picture on this side. And what I'm going to show you is when I put those two together, it looks like this. So that's what you're going to see, is both sides of the hive. Like that.
Where do you live?
Just outside Washington, D.C. Yeah. So it's... I know it's different here, but yeah. Okay, so this is January on a good year. You can see I've got quite a lot of bees in there. Okay, if you look at the lower left frame there, so the side of the frame there, when I jump to February, you'll see that how the population declines. Okay, so here's about a month later. Okay. But there's still plenty of bees. They're still looking good. Now here comes March. And what you can see is there's even fewer bees. But if you look at the upper frame, you can see it's mostly capped brood. Okay? And so I know from experience, when that fills up with capped brood, as a 2-frame hive, I'm in deep trouble. Okay? So anticipating that, at the end of the month, I put those 2 frames into a wooden nuke box and set that nuke box in exactly the same spot. Okay? So it looks like this. And you can see, still sitting on the hive scale, still got the tube going out the window, still got a feeder jar up there, but all 5 frames are in here. I've got a screen bottom board here, and then a solid bottom board to catch all the garbage they drop. And then I've got a screen top along with a solid top to more or less help hold in the heat. So I can still weigh them, I can still see them, hear them, smell them, but not as well, of course, as with an observation hive. So I left them like that for the month of April. And this is the weight chart of how the weight changed over April. And this takes some time to interpret, so I'll come back to it at the end of the year. So then starting in May, I took one frame with a queen in it out of that nuke box and put it back in the bottom of the hive and put a frame of foundation in the top to let them restart. Okay. So 2 weeks later, not a whole month, but just 2 weeks later, they were just about filling that top frame up with brood again. I said, oh, okay, well, I'll try once more. So for the month of June, I stuck them back in the nuke box again. And at the end of June, I said, okay, well, I restarted for July, and I said, this time I'm not going to be so dumb. Instead of putting the queen in there, I'm going to just put in a frame with some bees and some brood and some open uncapped brood and some eggs, and make them raise their own darn queen. That should slow them down a little bit. All right? But remember what I did when I showed you that chart. This is at the end of the nectar flow. There is no nectar flow now. Okay? So this was not too bright, that turns out. This hive, the colony actually, it doesn't look like there's that many bees in it now, and some of those were foragers, so there were even fewer. And they did start to raise a queen, but in the end, what happened is they were robbed like crazy. So I just nailed the door of the hive shut and did the best I could to keep them alive. But by the 1st of August, they were just gone. They never did manage to raise a queen. The foragers just gradually disappeared, and that was that. Okay. So, in September, a friend of mine was combining weak hives, and he's a good beekeeper, and he said, hey, I'm combining these hives. This one's got a laying queen. Do you want that queen? And I said, sure. So I restarted this hive with a frame of bees from one of my other colonies and his laying queen. Now look at the number of bees in there in September, late September. And here's late October. Fewer bees. Okay. Here's late November, even fewer bees. Yeah, she was a laying queen all right, but she was laying drones. Okay. So he didn't know. He didn't keep her that long. So it's not like my friend was trying to he just gave me the queen, but even so, it wasn't a very decent queen. So that was, so you can picture what's happening next here. Here's December, right? And they're still treating this queen like a queen. She's laying drones. She's laying drones in the brood comb, right? But around this time it's cold, but even in up that far north, we do get warm days. And on warm days in January, the bees would run around in there, and then they'd all go out. And that happened several times, and one of those times the queen went out and didn't come back. So that was the end of that. All right. So there's not a year that I'm very proud of, but a year that it was very educational. All right. So, Okay, back to April. So a nuke box full of 5 deep frames weighs about 50 pounds. Okay, so I started with 2 frames in there at the 1st of April. And what you can see here, so this is the month of April, and you can see that they kind of lost a little weight. On this day, I weighed the hive before filling the feeder, and then I filled the feeder, and then they consumed that feed. I filled the feeder again, they consumed the feed. I filled the feeder again, they consumed the feed. I forgot a few days, maybe I was at my girlfriend's house here. Then a 4-pound loss. Okay? And this hive they've got plenty of space, right? They've got a 50-pound capacity. They're up to like 35 pounds here. So nothing. It's not like they have a reason to swarm, but very clearly that's what happened. They're inside that nuke box. I was working, so I didn't see them go. I filled the feeder again, and right here is end of April, but you can see they started gaining weight on their own, okay? Which means the nectar flow started. And a couple days later, boom, a 2-pound swarm, all right? So even just with a hive scale, and this was a cheap electronic bathroom scale, which works just fine on an observation hive, you can tell a lot that's going on if you take the trouble to gather the data and to plot it, which I didn't until it was too late. But the thing is, you can see that when that nectar flow started, they were gone. And in fact, they even anticipated it. So that was a very interesting thing to learn. All right. Here's my favorite bumper sticker. Right? You can send me to college, but they can't make me think. How does it relate to bees? Well, your bees can send you messages, but they can't make you think either. You have to do that part yourself. And if they're out there in a wooden box in the back of the yard where you only see them every couple of weeks, they can't even send you messages. I mean, they can send them, but you're not in any position to get them. All right? So by having an observation hive, at least you get to hear the messages, and maybe you can get a chance to think. All right. In other words, it's easier to learn from your mistakes when they're visible, okay, as I've just shown you. And here's what I learned in this year. Swarms happen, right? At the start of the nectar flow, whether they need the space or not, whether you think they are going to swarm or not, they swarm, okay? You may not be there to see them, but if you gather the data, you'll see that they swarm, and they swarm again. That's what life is all about, reproduction, and that's what they do. The second thing was the robbing, okay? Why in the world would I start a weak hive after the nectar flow is over? You know, it's just not clever. You know, it's very obvious with hindsight, but I had to see it before to be reminded of it again. And finally, replacement queens should be checked for their quality. I mean, this guy was a friend of mine. He's a good beekeeper. He didn't charge me anything for the queen, but he had a laying queen, a perfectly good laying queen. But that wasn't obvious. Her faults weren't obvious until after a couple of weeks, when those bees should have emerged. The bees treated her like a laying queen. Okay. So, bottom line here: to become a better beekeeper, get yourself an observation hive. That's the preaching that I'm doing here. All right. Any questions at this part before I go into the details of how to get yourself an observation hive?
Do you never cover it up? Never darken it?
No,
They don't cover the glass? by
they
themselves?
don't care. I can flick the lights on and off. The first day or two I put bees in there, I flick the lights on, they go woohoo! But then after a day or two, they don't care. They don't care about lights, they don't care about noise, they don't care about cooking, they don't care about vacuum cleaners. They just ignore everything unless I actually jiggle the hive, like when I'm going to weigh it, if I'm not really careful weighing it. But apart from that, they are fine. Yeah.
So do you set up an observation hive only indoors, or could you set it up outside?
I have had both indoors and outdoors. I had a full size, like three deeps and a medium on my deck for a whole summer. So, but it has to be in the shade. It has that, yeah. It doesn't have to be in your house, but it should be where you can easily see it. Yeah. Yep, back there.
The answer to this question might be obvious, but it's not to me. How do you remove a frame of bees indoors and not get bees all over?
Okay, I'll talk about that in the next part. Yep. Okay. Any other questions before I go ahead? Okay. So now the how-to part here. And the segments I'll cover here are preparing yourself in the place you're going to put the hive, selecting a hive, installing it, okay, working the hive, which is your question, maintaining it, and then some fun things to do with it. Okay. I suggest you have some beekeeping experience. I didn't really have any. I started with just the observation hive. I suggest you have some, or at least have another full-size hive with it. I tried to do just the observation hive, and that didn't work too well. Think about the way you take care of your hive now in terms of dealing with parasites and pests and predators and pesticides. All the stuff you deal now, all the interventions you have to make with your hive, how are you going to do that with an observation hive, which is inside rather than outside? Formic acid vaporization for mite treatments, for example. Okay? You have to think about swarming. Because it is a small hive, they do tend to swarm more often. I'd say that's the biggest thing, the biggest downside of an observation hive. Okay? You may have to feed the hive as necessary. Sometimes they'll take a lot of feed, sometimes a little. Sometimes you don't have to worry about it. And there's three kinds of knowledge that you need here. At least I'd suggest you have either a reference book or a source for. One is your standard beekeeping expertise. One is all about bees. What are bees doing? What do they do in the hive? You need a way to help you interpret what it is you're seeing. Otherwise, it's just a bunch of bugs in there. But you really need to understand what it is you're looking at, and a reference helps that. And then finally, some sort of a reference for observation hives. Okay. The next thing you need to think about is where you're going to put this hive. Okay. It needs to be suitable for the bees, but also suitable for you. You want it to be easy to see. Okay? And then if there's other people in your life, if you don't live by yourself, then you need to think about how are their lives going to be affected by it. Okay? The hive needs to be shaded. If you look on the web for observation hives, you'll see plenty of times where people say, yeah, I took my observation hive to the farmer's market and the comb all melted. It's like, why did you leave it out in the sun? So you need to think about the temperature in the place where the hive is. In the wintertime, at least up north where I am, the hive needs to be at least 65 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay? It can stand short times cooler than that, but not for a prolonged period. Okay? You need a place to work the hive, which is typically near the hive exterior entrance. You need a standard hive for backup. That's something I should be doing? Okay. Okay. Standard hive for backup. Good illumination. If you look at the hive, it's often easy to see that a hive in a place like this. It'll often be hard to actually.
Point it towards your face instead of straight up. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Yep. All right. You need a source of illumination, just some sort of a light to shine onto the hive. And then finally, the glass or the plexiglass will get quite dirty, and you need a way to get that propolis off the glass. So you need to be able to clean the glass as necessary. Next thing to think about is what the observation hive really ought to have. Okay? And the first thing to think about is bee space. On my hive, this side has just enough space for one layer of bees. Okay? The other side has space for 2 or 3 layers of bees. And the bees like that side. But you can't see anything over there unless there happens to be just a few bees in it. On this side, you can see everything. Right? So you need some space, but not too much. And what goes with that is not having too many bees in there. Okay? Movable frames. Okay? You can buy hives that don't have movable frames. Really bad idea. And they should be the same size as the standard frames in all your other hives. Okay? You need a way to close the entrance so you can take the hive outside to work on it, or do. Okay, and I use just thin sheets of metal or plastic that would swing down over the ends, and I plug the tube with a cork. Okay, the hive should be easy to move, and that means like this hive weighs about 35 pounds when it's full of bees and honey, but I can easily lift that up and carry it around and get it outside to work on it. There's a hive in a nature center north of Tampa that's 10 deep frames, but it's 5 vertical frames and then a whole nuke box on the top. So you think that is really ungainly, but they've got a big platform on casters, so they can roll the whole thing outside and roll it back in. So whatever works for you is fine, but it's got to be quite movable. Okay, and then finally, if it's in a public space, I'd suggest a duplicate hive just so you can swap hives out and always have one going. While you clean up the other one.
Do you want me to advance those for you?
I don't mind doing it as long as it's okay. Yeah. All right. The next thing is selecting your hive, and there's a bunch of trade-offs you can make here. The bigger the hive, up to 10 deep frames, the better the bees like it. The smaller one is easier for you, right? You can have a temporary hive outside or inside, or you can have it permanent. Even if it's sealed up, you could keep it for a week or two, but you're much better off keeping it longer. Obviously the choice of a personal or a public hive, but I'm really thinking here about personal hives. And finally, a quality of workmanship can be, just something you slap together out of scrap lumber and old storm windows, or a really nice hive. You can spend a lot of money on observation hives. I'll give you a few examples here. This is a brushy mountain hive on the left. It's very popular. It works okay. There's a queen excluder between the bottom and the top. The idea is you put the frame with the queen on it up on top for display, but typically what happens is there's too much bee space around that top frame and you get too many bees up there. On the right hand side is a draper hive. They are beautiful and they're expensive, and the empty hive weighs 50 pounds. Right? So you can imagine what it weighs when it's full. So you need a couple of people to get that one out of the house if you have it. Okay? The one on the left here is the modern version of the hive I have. This is what Better Bee sells now. The one on the right is a hive from Kelly. It's just a single, holds 1 deep frame. It's pretty cheap. You buy the unpainted wood and plexiglass and assemble it yourself. But it's usable. On the left here is a full-size top bar hive made out of plexiglass by a friend of mine. Okay, you can see he's just started to have, the bees have just started to fill it up. This was in his dining room, sitting on top of the TV, in a little tiny house with a large number of kids. And I said, "Stuart, how do you work this hive? And how do you get it outside?" He says, "Oh, I don't." He said, "I put up the drop cloths and close the door and open the windows, and I work it right here in the dining room." Okay, so the point is there's more than one way to go about this. Okay, yeah, right. And then the one on the right is very cute, right? It comes with the bees in it, no experience necessary, non-standard frames, hangs on your walls, it's modular. This is a Kickstarter project that didn't get funded, and I'm really happy about that because it's, this is, the bees that came with it would soon die, and that would be the end of it. It's just clever in some ways, but not clever enough to be a viable hive. Okay. All right, so installing your hive. Here's what you got to do, even if you buy one that comes ready to go. Okay, it's not really. You still have to assemble it. Paint it or stain it, whatever you need to do with that. Get a hive stand. In this case, my hive stand is just a bookcase from the IKEA furniture store. Think about the easy way to get the frames out of there. Like if you look at that hive over there, that observation hive, the frames, I'm not sure. I think you have to take the glass out before you take the frames out. And that's a pretty tricky thing to do because the glass is stuck in once the bees have gotten to work there. Okay? But even if you have a door on one side, if the frames are resting like down inside a frame rest with ears on both sides, it can be really hard to get the frames out. So you might have to modify it to just think about how am I going to get these frames out of here when it's jammed full, really stuck down with both sides, right? You need an entrance tube. This is just 1-inch plastic pipe from a big box store, and it comes all coiled up and looks really stiff, but if you drop it in really hot water, it'll soften up and you can straighten it out. In terms of an exterior entrance, in the several places where I've had one of these hives, I just take a piece of wood and put it in the window, and I can see that's what's been done back there. And then you put a hole in the piece of wood and put your tube into that, and the bees can come and go. The window doesn't quite close anymore, but you can just put a little bit of insulating foam to keep air from and other bugs from going in and out the gap in the window. I put a landing board underneath that, again, so that bees wouldn't poop on the windowsill, but onto the landing board. And you might remember seeing in the picture where I nailed the cover, the entrance shut, there was a container there. I was hoping that would be a dead bee trap. I was hoping the bees would bring out the dead bees and just drop them, and I could count them. But it turns out that, of course, that they fly off and drop them. So I couldn't count dead bees at all that way. But that's a nice thing that you can mess around with it. You need to be able to plug or cover all the openings. Before I move this, I take the feeder off and cover that opening up. You can see too that the feeder has a plexiglass. It came with a solid plastic base. So I just made one out of plexiglass so I could see the bees in there. And then airflow control, I'll go into some detail on that here. In the winter, in where I live, cold air is coming into the house on one side and going out of the house on the other side. And in a standard house, the air changes about once an hour. So there's always air coming in and going out. And you can see in the top left picture, cold winter air coming in and sort of driving the bees right away from there. And in the bottom left picture, you can see in the summertime, the bees are trying to cool that hive down, and they're fanning the air out that tube, and that's a pretty hopeless task. They're not making much progress there. All right. So you've got two separate problems here. One is you want air to go in and out of the house the way it normally does without flowing through the hive, because that doesn't allow the bees to maintain the temperature and the other factors that they control in the hive. They control temperature, humidity, carbon dioxide level, and so on, right? So you need to let the air go in and out of the house without going through the hive, and then you need a way for the bees to control what goes in and out of the hive. And the way I addressed that problem was to put a screened-in porch on the hive. So this is a screened-in porch here. So now the air comes in, and it can go out into the house, or it comes from the house and out, and then the bees just have to move the air from one side to the other. There, okay. And that happens to be just a container from a office supply store for putting paper clips in or something. Yeah.
So they think you're an enabler.
Yeah, I mean, you could just drill holes in the tubing. There's lots of ways to go about it, but you could give them something where the air, let the bees control the flow. All right, working your hive. Routine inspections are very easy. Okay, yeah, okay. But other than that, then it's a little bit different from your standard hive. I close up for the second part here, opening, manipulating, and closing up. I close up the entrances, as I said, carry the hive outside, open the hive up. I take the frames out and set them into a nuke box. And then any bees that are left in the hive, I shake them into that nuke box, cover it up, and just let it sit there. and then I scrape down the inside of the hive so that I can close it, so that everything closes up nicely. Scrape the excess wax off the windows and stuff like that. If I need to clean the windows, I have to put them in a nuke box for a few days, because you can't clean the windows that quickly. But a quick scraping works. Then I do whatever I need to do with the bees, and when I'm ready to take it back inside, I just lift those frames out of the nuke box and set them into the observation hive and close the door quickly. That way I'm not crunching bees, there's no bees on the outside of it, and then carry it back in, set it back up, and the bees, any bees that are left outside will fly to the entrance and go back in that way. So that works very well. Installing bees, you could buy a package and pour it in, but it's not that easy. You're much better off just transferring a couple of frames into the hive. A big problem you'll have, as I said before, is if you have a small hive, you'll often have too many bees. And here's a list of 6 things you can do about that. One is you can just let them swarm. Right? In my neighborhood, that is really not a good idea. I live in an urban area. Okay? But you can remove a frame with brood and just keep taking out a frame. Pardon me?
It's good for the bee removal guy.
Yep, yeah, yeah. That's not me. And yeah, the neighbors aren't all that happy about those swarms flying through the air. You can remove a frame with just the brood and just keep taking that frame out and sticking it into another hive. Or you can take a frame out with the queen, but you don't want to do that during a drought, right? You can also just cage the queen and keep her very limited, or you can put a queen excluder between the frames. I haven't done that myself, but others have recommended it. You can just reduce the feed. You don't have to constantly feed them. If there's a drought, you just let them do what bees do when there's a drought. Just let them a dearth. Let them slowly die off. And finally, like you saw what I did before, you can just expand the colony into a nuke box, take one frame out, sell the nuke, and restart your observation hive. I do put up swarm traps, and you'll need to think about how you deal with varroa mites, small hive beetles, wax moths, and so on. Besides observing them, you may want to treat for them as well. Feeding, it's easy enough to put a feeder on the hive. If it's a time when they need a lot of feed and you're going away, then you might need to change the feeder that comes with it and put a bigger feeder on. I haven't really found that to be a problem, but you might. Overwintering, as I said, up where I live, you really can't let the bees get below 65 Fahrenheit for very long. I typically set my thermostat for 55 overnight, and the bees can deal with that. But I think I came down to Florida one time in 2 weeks, and I set the house at 55, and the colony almost died. And quite a few of the bees died, quite a lot of the brood died, but I managed to save it, but it was just a mistake. They couldn't deal with 55. They can deal with 65, all right. Yeah, yeah, that's up there. Just a couple of words about observation hives in public places. There's 2 kinds of those. One is the temporary portable ones, like the one on the left here, the Kelly one that I showed you. And here it is with a frame of bees in it. And you just select a frame that's got honey and open brood and capped brood, and maybe or maybe not the queen, depending on how you want to disturb the hive you take the frame out of. But that's very convenient and very good for educational purposes. And on the right there you see a permanent display set up in a museum, and that's a whole different kettle of fish. You need really, besides the beekeeper, you need somebody to design the exhibits, somebody to answer questions, somebody who will call the beekeeper when it's necessary. It's a lot. It takes several people, or at least people in several different roles, and a good deal of work, because you don't want too many bees. You don't want too few bees. You don't want old black comb. You know, there's a lot of, you really want it to look nice, and you want people to have some idea of what it is they're seeing in there. And then there are many, many themes that could be built around that beehive. So you want a museum exhibits person to be able to take advantage of that hive. Photography is just great. You don't need an expensive camera. You can see on the right-hand side, you can see an emergency queen cell there. On the left-hand side, you can see the hive just after a swarm. I think the bottom had black plastic frame in it. But the top, you can see the cap brood in the middle, and then you can see that arc of pollen around it. It just shows up really nicely. The other little things in the corner there were temperature sensors. I was remotely monitoring the temperature of that hive. That's a different talk. And you can mess around with this hive in many, many, many ways. And everything that you read about seeing bees do, you can observe those things and note them. So, as I say, you can take a census periodically. I do that with a camera. You can weigh the hive daily. The last 5 days for my hive in Washington now, the first 3 of those 5 days it gained 0.4 pounds a day. Then one day it gained only 0.1, and then one day it lost 0.1. So it looked like nectar flow, nectar flow, nectar flow, and then whoops, gone. Really quite interesting. You can interpret the dance language, right? You can modify the hive in all kinds of ways. There's a guy in Philadelphia who works with people from the School of Fine Arts, and he puts live bees into the art museum in Philadelphia with bees inside a conch shell, and just all kinds of crazy things that it's quite amazing. There's people put into a box. They'll put in some sort of structure made with foundation, and the bees will draw out the comb in some weird way, and you can find that kind of stuff on the internet. In the picture here is Juliana Rangel, who's now a professor, but she was at Tom Seeley's lab. She is recording. You can see her finger in the video screen there. She is recording worker piping. Worker bees pipe about an hour or so before bees swarm. Okay? So those kinds of discoveries are still being made in observation hives today. Von Frisch got his Nobel Prize for discovering the bee dance back in the 1950s, but observation hives are still very useful research tools. Yeah.
Dr. Rangel will be coming to Northwest Arkansas.
Okay, yeah. So, and there she is. Yeah. Okay, so for more information, you can buy my book. I've got a few copies here, or you can get it from Man Lake or Better Bee. A new version is coming out from the Cornell University Press. That'll be available in the fall. Or you can just go to the website, and it's there. So, thebeepeaker.com. Oh, thanks.